Arrogant man insults Johnny Depp in first-class flight. Immediately regrets it when the truth is revealed. Yes, you heard it right. Imagine being on a first-class flight, surrounded by luxury, and sitting next to a man who thinks he's the center of the universe. He starts bad-mouthing celebrities, laughing, and making harsh jokes about the famous. What he doesn't realize is that the target of his sharp words is right beside him, disguised. And who's the target? Johnny Depp. The one and only Johnny Depp. What happens when this arrogant man, so full of himself, realizes that what he said wasn't just a mistake, but that he ended up insulting someone far greater than he could have imagined? Regret comes quickly, but is it too late? Now stop and think. Have you ever judged someone wrongly? What if that person turned out to be someone much more important than you thought? What would you do at that moment? You won't believe what happens next. Stay tuned, because this story will surprise you at every turn. And if you love twists and life lessons, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Let's dive into this story together. The first-class cabin was gliding smoothly through the clouds, heading toward its destination. Passengers relaxed in their luxurious seats, savoring the privilege of a flight few could afford. Among them, one man stood out, not for the elegance of his attire, but for the arrogance radiating from his posture. He sat back in his seat with a smug grin, surveying the other passengers with a look of disdain. Every move he made seemed calculated to assert his self-proclaimed superiority. He spoke loudly, laughing at his own jokes and making cutting remarks about celebrities. "These actors," he said, as if dispensing great wisdom, "don't know what real work is. They just make money playing ridiculous roles. If I were one of them, I'd be way more successful." Other passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances, but no one dared to interrupt. They could sense that this man thought his opinion was the only one that mattered. He was so caught up in his bubble of superiority that he had no clue he was about to face a moment of reckoning he'd never forget. Sitting nearby, a man in sunglasses and a hoodie appeared to be just another ordinary passenger. His face was obscured, but there was something about his demeanor that made him stand out. He didn't seem bothered by the arrogant man's comments. In fact, he seemed mildly amused, as if he knew something big was about to happen, something that would change everything. The arrogant man, oblivious to the presence of the other, continued his tirade. "These artists are so unnecessary," he declared with a smirk. "They could do something more useful, but they prefer to live in luxury. I could do so much more with what they have. I'd be way better." Then he glanced at the man next to him, the one in sunglasses, and made a seemingly harmless comment that was about to unleash a major twist. "These kinds of lives, all these celebrities thinking they're special. It's absurd. I could be way more than any of them." The man in sunglasses said nothing. He remained silent, but his eyes sparkled. He didn't respond, but something in his expression made the arrogant man uneasy without knowing why. It was as if he had struck a nerve far deeper than he realized. The arrogant man turned away again, still oblivious that he was about to make a fatal mistake. He didn't know that sitting beside him was none other than Johnny Depp in disguise, and that his despicable words would trigger a reaction he'd never forget. As the plane continued its smooth flight, the tension in the air began to rise. The arrogant man, blissfully unaware of the man sitting beside him, continued his rant about the ridiculousness of the entertainment industry. He leaned back in his seat, completely absorbed in his own superiority, convinced that everyone around him was hanging on his every word. "Honestly," he said, turning to the man beside him, "if I had the chance, I could do so much better than these celebrities. They get paid millions for pretending to be someone else. It's laughable. I mean, look at them. They're all the same, just chasing after fame and fortune, with no real talent." The man with the sunglasses remained still, his expression unreadable. He didn't engage, didn't offer a single word of agreement or disagreement. But his silence seemed to weigh heavily in the cabin, drawing the attention of a few nearby passengers who were now beginning to notice the uncomfortable interaction. The arrogant man, feeling the silence pressing in on him, decided to push further. "You know, I've always thought that if I were in their shoes, I could change the game. I could be better than any of them. Just look at the roles they play. They're all so predictable. It's all about looks and popularity, nothing about real substance. There was a brief pause. The man with the sunglasses slowly turned his head, his eyes locking onto the arrogant man's. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. The arrogant man, oblivious to the gravity of the moment, smiled arrogantly, waiting for a response. But there was none. The silence stretched out longer than he expected. He cleared his throat, trying to fill the void with his own voice. "So, what do you think? Do you agree with me?" The man with the sunglasses finally spoke, his voice calm, almost too calm. "You really think you could do better than Johnny Depp?" The words hung in the air, as if the entire cabin had stopped breathing. The arrogant man blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. Johnny Depp? The actor? He looked over at the man beside him again, trying to gauge if this was some kind of joke. "Johnny Depp?" he repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief. "That's who you're talking about? The guy who spends his life playing pirates and pretending to be someone he's not." The man with the sunglasses didn't flinch. "Yeah, that's who I'm talking about." The arrogant man laughed, a short, dismissive sound. "You gotta be kidding me. There's no way that's him. No way. Johnny Depp would never be caught dead in a place like this, looking like that." The man with the sunglasses leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "You'd be surprised?" The arrogant man's laughter faded, replaced by a flicker of doubt. He had no idea who he was really talking to. He had no idea that the very man he was mocking was sitting right next to him, listening to every word. But Johnny Depp, in all his quiet dignity, didn't need to say anything. He let the arrogant man dig his own hole. The arrogant man's confidence began to waver. He glanced at the man beside him again, as if trying to find a sign that he was being pranked. But there was no sign of a joke. No smirk, no raised eyebrow, just the same calm, unwavering presence. Johnny Depp, if that's who he really was, hadn't reacted the way he expected. There was no outburst, no defense, just silence. And that silence was starting to make him uncomfortable. For a moment, the arrogant man reconsidered his words. Maybe he had gone too far. But no, he quickly brushed the thought aside. After all, he was the one in control here, wasn't he? He was the one who knew better. He was the one who understood what real talent was. He couldn't let a little doubt creep in now. He had to stand by his opinion. "Well," he said, forcing a chuckle, "even if you were Johnny Depp, I still think you're overrated. You've made a career out of playing the same types of characters over and over again. How many pirates can one man play before it gets old?" The man with the sunglasses didn't react. He didn't even seem to be listening. His gaze remained steady, his posture relaxed. But there was something in the air now, something that made the arrogant man's words feel hollow. It was as if the very presence of the man beside him was somehow defying everything he believed in. The arrogant man shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "What I mean is," he continued, trying to salvage the conversation, "I could do more with the kind of fame you have. I could use it for something real, something meaningful. Fame is just a tool, you know? It's not about the fame itself. It's about what you do with it." Johnny Depp's lips twitched slightly, almost imperceptibly. But he didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than any words he could have said. The arrogant man, however, was still on a roll. He was too far gone now, too deep into his own narrative to stop. He had to prove his point. "You know," he said, leaning in a little closer, "the problem with people like you is that you think you're untouchable. You think you can get away with anything because you're famous. But you're just like everyone else. You're just a man no different from me." At this, Johnny Depp finally spoke, his voice low but steady, carrying an authority that immediately commanded attention. "You're right about one thing. I'm just a man. But there's something you're missing." The arrogant man's eyes narrowed. "What's that?" Johnny Depp turned to face him fully, his gaze unwavering. "I'm not the one who's untouchable. You are. You've built your life on the illusion of control, on the idea that your opinions are the only ones that matter. But here's the thing. Real strength isn't in tearing others down. It's in lifting them up." The arrogant man's smug expression faltered for the first time. He didn't know how to respond. He wasn't used to being challenged like this, especially not by someone he had dismissed so easily. Johnny Depp's words were simple, but they carried weight. And for the first time, the arrogant man felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: doubt. Johnny Depp continued, his voice calm but firm. You think you know what it's like to walk in someone else's shoes, to understand their struggles, their challenges. But you don't. You're too busy looking down on everyone around you to see the bigger picture. The arrogant man shifted in his seat, feeling the walls he had built around himself begin to crumble. He had spent so much time convincing himself that he was better than others, that his opinions were the only ones worth listening to. But now, in the face of Johnny Depp's quiet confidence, he was beginning to realize how small he had made himself. Johnny Depp leaned back in his seat, his expression softening just a little. You're not as untouchable as you think you are. None of us are. We're all just people, trying to make our way through this world. And if you want to make a real impact, you need to start by respecting others, not tearing them down. The arrogant man swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. For the first time in his life, he wasn't sure of his own convictions. He had spent so much time convincing himself that he was right, that he had the answers to everything. But Johnny Depp's words had planted a seed of doubt in his mind, and now he was starting to question everything he had believed in. The flight continued its steady course, but the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. The arrogant man, once so full of himself, was now quieter, his mind racing. Johnny Depp's words had hit him harder than he expected. It wasn't just the idea of being wrong. It was the realization that he had been living in a bubble, surrounded by his own inflated sense of self-worth. For the first time, he found himself questioning everything he had ever believed about fame, success, and what it meant to be truly important. But before he could process these thoughts any further, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing that they were nearing their destination. The flight was almost over. But something else happened, something that would change the arrogant man's perception forever. Just as the plane began its descent, the man with the sunglasses, Johnny Depp, stood up. He moved with the same quiet confidence that had unsettled the arrogant man earlier. But this time, he wasn't just sitting there, letting the conversation unfold. This time, he was taking action. Johnny Depp walked to the front of the plane, his footsteps echoing through the cabin. The arrogant man, still lost in thought, barely noticed. But as Johnny reached the front, something caught his eye. The flight attendants were now looking at him differently. They weren't just smiling politely anymore. They were looking at him with something else, something deeper. One of the flight attendants, a young woman with wide eyes, approached Johnny Depp. She spoke in a hushed tone, as if she didn't want to draw attention to what was happening. Mr. Depp, we're so sorry, but there's been a small issue with your seat. We'll need to move you to another part of the plane. The arrogant man's ears perked up. Mr. Depp? It took a moment for the realization to hit him. He was Johnny Depp. The man he had been mocking, the man he had so easily dismissed, was none other than the Hollywood legend himself. His stomach sank. He felt a flush of embarrassment wash over him. All the words he had said, the jokes, the criticisms, came rushing back to him, and he could hardly believe how foolish he had been. But it wasn't just the realization that he had insulted one of the world's most famous actors. It was the fact that Johnny Depp had been sitting there, listening to it all, without saying a word. Johnny Depp turned back to the arrogant man, his gaze steady but filled with a quiet amusement. He didn't say anything at first, just gave a slight nod as if acknowledging the situation. The arrogant man, unable to look him in the eye, mumbled something incoherent, his face flushed with shame. Mr. Depp, the flight attendant said again, her voice now more insistent. We really need to move you to another seat. Johnny Depp nodded and followed the attendant down the aisle, leaving the arrogant man alone in his seat. But before he disappeared from view, Johnny turned back one last time. His voice was soft, but there was a hint of a smile in it. You might want to think about what I said. You never know who's sitting next to you. The words stung. The arrogant man felt a wave of guilt crash over him. He had been so sure of himself, so convinced that he was right. But now, with the full weight of his actions crashing down on him, he realized just how wrong he had been. As the plane touched down and the passengers began to disembark, the arrogant man sat in his seat, motionless. The flight attendants had long since moved on, and the rest of the passengers were already making their way to the exit. But he couldn't bring himself to leave. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had just witnessed something far greater than he had ever imagined. Johnny Depp, an actor, a man who had seen and done more than most people could ever dream, had humbled him in a way that no one else ever could. And in that moment, the arrogant man understood. He understood that true strength wasn't in belittling others, in making them feel small. It was in lifting them up, in acknowledging their worth, no matter how different they might seem from you. The arrogant man had barely moved from his seat as the last of the passengers filed out of the plane. His mind was spinning, replaying every word he had said to Johnny Depp, every insult, every dismissive comment. He had never felt so small in his life. The realization was like a heavy weight pressing down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. For the first time in years, he felt completely out of control. His usual confidence, the sense of superiority he had carried with him for so long, had evaporated. All that remained was a man who had been humbled by his own arrogance. He sat there, staring out the window, his thoughts a blur. He thought about what Johnny Depp had said, the words that had stung so deeply, the challenge to rethink his entire perspective on life. He thought about how easy it had been for him to judge others, to assume that he was somehow better than them. But now, he realized how wrong he had been. It wasn't just about fame or success. It wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room or having the most followers. It was about respect. It was about understanding that everyone, no matter who they were, had their own journey, their own struggles, their own story to tell. And it was about recognizing the humanity in others, even when they seemed so different from you. As the last few passengers disembarked, the arrogant man finally stood up. His legs felt heavy, like he was walking through water, but he forced himself to move. He had to do something. He had to make things right. He walked down the aisle, his eyes scanning the empty seats, until he spotted the flight attendant who had been so kind to Johnny Depp. She was standing by the door, chatting with a colleague, but when she saw him approaching, she gave him a polite smile. The arrogant man hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to begin. But then, he took a deep breath and walked up to her. I owe you an apology, he said, his voice rough. I've been a complete jerk, and I need to make it right. The flight attendant raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. What do you mean? I mean, the arrogant man continued, I've been so wrapped up in my own world, so focused on what I think I know, that I've forgotten to see people for who they really are. I treated Johnny Depp like he was just some guy. And I was wrong. I was wrong about him. And I was wrong about myself. The flight attendant's expression softened. It's okay. We all make mistakes. No, the arrogant man said, shaking his head. It's not okay. I need to do better. I need to stop judging people based on who I think they are and start seeing them for who they really are. The flight attendant smiled warmly. That's a good start. As the arrogant man walked out of the plane, he felt a strange sense of relief. The weight on his chest had lifted, and he felt lighter, like he was finally free from the prison of his own arrogance. He had a long way to go, but he knew that this moment, this lesson, would stay with him forever. And as he stepped into the airport terminal, he saw the world differently. He saw the people around him, not as obstacles or competitors, but as fellow travelers on this journey called life. He saw their stories, their struggles, their triumphs. And for the first time in a long time, he felt a deep sense of respect for them. Johnny Depp had taught him something that no one else ever could. He had shown him the true meaning of strength, not in tearing others down, but in lifting them up. And that lesson would stay with him, guiding him as he navigated the rest of his life. The days that followed the flight were nothing short of a revelation for the arrogant man. He couldn't stop thinking about the conversation with Johnny Depp, about the apology he had given to the flight attendant, and about the transformation that was slowly unfolding within him. It wasn't something that happened overnight, but every day he felt a little lighter, a little more aware of the people around him. The world outside seemed different now. The bustling streets, the crowded cafes, the people rushing past him, they all seemed more human, more real. He had spent so many years looking down on others, thinking that his success and wealth gave him the right to judge, but now he saw them with new eyes. They weren't just faceless strangers. They were individuals with their own stories, their own struggles, their own worth. But the most surprising part of all was how others began to react to him. It wasn't just his change in perspective that had shifted things. It was how people responded to his newfound humility. The more he listened, the more he learned, the more he respected those around him. And in turn, they began to see him differently too. At work, his colleagues noticed the change. The arrogant man, who had once been the loudest in the room, now listened more than he spoke. He took the time to understand the perspectives of others, to ask questions instead of making assumptions. And as he did, he found that people began to open up to him in ways they never had before. His boss, who had always kept him at arm's length, started to seek his input on important projects. His friends, who had once found his arrogance grating, began to invite him out more often, to share their own experiences and thoughts. Even strangers on the street seemed to treat him with more respect, as if they could sense the change within him. The most profound moment came when he ran into an old acquaintance at a cafe. This was someone he hadn't seen in years, someone he had once looked down on for not achieving the same level of success. But now, as they sat down and caught up, the arrogant man found himself genuinely interested in their life, in their struggles, in their dreams. And as they talked, he realized just how much he had missed by dismissing people like this in the past. The acquaintance looked at him with a curious smile. "You've changed," they said. "There's something different about you." The arrogant man paused, feeling a warmth spread through him. "Yeah," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "I think I have." And in that moment, he realized that the change wasn't just about how others saw him. It was about how he saw himself. He wasn't the same man who had boarded that plane a few weeks ago, full of arrogance and pride. He wasn't the same man who had mocked Johnny Depp. He had become someone who understood the value of humility, of empathy, of seeing the world through the eyes of others. Johnny Depp's words had been the catalyst for this transformation, but it was his own willingness to change, to grow, that had made it possible. And as he looked around at the people in his life, his colleagues, his friends, even strangers, he realized that the world had opened up to him in ways he never could have imagined. The arrogant man had learned the most important lesson of all, that true strength lies not in tearing others down, but in lifting them up. And as he embraced this new way of living, he felt a deep sense of peace settle over him, knowing that he was no longer defined by his arrogance, but by his ability to see and appreciate the humanity in everyone he met. As the arrogant man walked through the streets, his mind was calm, his heart at ease. The transformation that had taken place within him was not just a fleeting change. It was a permanent shift in how he viewed the world, how he interacted with others, and most importantly, how he saw himself. It wasn't something he could have predicted, nor could he have imagined the depth of the impact it would have on his life. He thought back to the moment when Johnny Depp had looked him in the eye and called him out for his arrogance. He had been angry then, defensive even, but now he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude for that moment. It had been the wake-up call he didn't even know he needed. Without it, he might have continued down the same path of self-centeredness and pride, never realizing the richness of the world around him. As he sat on a park bench, watching the people pass by, he reflected on everything he had learned. It wasn't just about being humble. It was about understanding. It was about seeing the value in others, not based on their status or wealth, but on their inherent worth as human beings. He had spent so many years measuring people by what they could offer him, but now he measured them by the depth of their character, the kindness in their hearts, and the strength in their souls. He thought about the flight attendant, who had been so kind to him despite his earlier behavior. She had been a reminder that kindness could break through even the hardest of shells. And he thought about Johnny Depp, who had shown him that true strength wasn't about being untouchable, but about embracing vulnerability and empathy. The arrogant man knew that he still had a long way to go. There would be days when he would slip, when old habits would try to creep back in. But now he had the tools to recognize those moments, to pause and reflect before reacting. He had learned that it was okay to be wrong, that it was okay to admit mistakes, and that it was okay to change. As he stood up from the bench and walked back to his apartment, he felt a sense of peace he had never known before. He was no longer defined by his past arrogance. He was defined by his willingness to learn, to grow, and to become a better version of himself. The world was no longer a place where he had to fight for recognition or approval. It was a place where he could simply exist, where he could connect with others, where he could be part of something bigger than himself. Johnny Depp had changed his life, but it wasn't just because of the confrontation on the plane. It was because Johnny had shown him what it meant to be human, to be humble, to be kind, and to be open to the world around you. And for that, he would be forever grateful. As the arrogant man walked through the streets, he felt a sense of gratitude he hadn't known before. It was as if the weight of the world had been lifted from his shoulders, and for the first time in years, he felt truly free. Free from the expectations he had placed on himself, free from the need to prove anything to anyone, and free from the arrogance that had once defined him. He thought back to the moment when he had first insulted Johnny Depp on the plane. He had been so sure of himself, so convinced that his words had power. But now he understood how hollow that power had been. True power, he realized, wasn't in belittling others. It was in lifting them up and seeing them for who they truly were, and in showing them the respect they deserved. He had learned a valuable lesson, one that many people never get the chance to learn. The world didn't owe him anything. The people around him didn't owe him anything. If he wanted to be respected, he had to earn it, not by flaunting his wealth or his status, but by showing kindness, humility, and understanding. Johnny Depp had been the catalyst for this transformation, but it was his own willingness to change that had made it all possible. And as he walked through the city, he realized that he no longer needed to chase after validation. He no longer needed to prove himself. The only thing that mattered now was the person he was becoming, and that person was someone he could be proud of. He knew there would be challenges ahead. There would be moments when his old habits would try to resurface, when the temptation to judge or belittle would be strong. But now, he had the strength to resist. He had learned the power of empathy, of truly listening to others, of understanding their struggles and their triumphs. And in doing so, he had learned to love and appreciate the world around him in a way he never had before. As he stood at the edge of the park, watching the sunset, he felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. He had made mistakes, yes, but he had also learned from them. He had hurt people, but he had also made amends. And in the process, he had become a better person, a person who could look at others with compassion, with respect, and with the understanding that we are all just trying to navigate this world the best we can. And so, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the arrogant man smiled to himself. He had found something more valuable than wealth, more important than status. He had found the true meaning of human connection, and that, he knew, was worth more than anything money could buy.